We're talking about a new book. It's called Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. And what I'm going to try to do is see if I can quickly walk through sort of the central ideas that are in the book and the central figures that I look at. The title of the book comes from the poet, Blake scholar, and essayist Kathleen Raine, who you may be aware of. She, for many years, was involved with something that was known as the Temenos Academy, which was a sort of, even though it was called the Academy, it was kind of a non-academic kind of learning institution. But the learning it was devoted to wasn't the sort of learning that you might find in universities, regular run-of-the-mill universities. It was learning of the imagination. It was a learning of this lost knowledge of the imagination, what Kathleen Raine also referred to as the excluded knowledge or the rejected knowledge. And the reason she called it this lost knowledge of the imagination was because literally when she was coming of age when she was at university in Cambridge in the his 20s and 30s. She always loved poetry. She read poetry. She was writing it, as we all do, when we were teens. But this, she was actually writing real poetry then. But she also had a great love of nature, and the two to her didn't seem, antithetical. The sort of detailed observation that she devoted herself to as just a child, growing up and looking at the wonders. She grew up on sort of the borderlands, Scottish and English up there, and in science, the same sort of thing, this kind of exact observation and attention to detail. So when she finally went to Cambridge, she thought rather than study literature, which she thought was kind of silly to do because she was reading all this stuff anyway, that she would study something that she didn't have firsthand knowledge of already, and this was science. But she didn't give up on poetry, and she didn't give up on literature. But she quickly discovered that the sort of poetry and the sort of literature that was being read by her new friends in Cambridge wasn't the sort that she had grown up with. Her favorites were the Romantic poets, or a little bit earlier than that, people like Blake, who had said she was a Blake scholar. She's most known for the many different books and essays and studies of Blake's work that she produced. But also people like Shelley and Keats and Coleridge, and later W.B. Yeats. And what she found that all of these people were considered very passé. They were very much out of vogue. And the whole sort of romantic or idealist tradition or sensibility was very much not the going thing. What she found was a whole school of poetry and a whole school of literary criticism and a whole sort of attitude toward the world that was more founded upon a kind of scientific point of view. And by scientific, in many ways not the kind of sense of wonder that she herself found by studying natural forms, but this kind of sort of reductive or oversimplifying in order to explain things very neatly in a very kind of concise, in its own way. It had its own sort of beauty or its own sort of elegance, but it was a way that excluded practically everything that she had felt was important. And so what she discovered while she was there was that she couldn't really tell people that she was interested in people like Shelley or Yeats or Blake, because they would have considered her rather kind of strange or romantic. Romantic was a very bad word. It was kind of a word that had taken on a very pejorative sort of meaning. It meant someone who didn't have their feet on the ground and their head was in the clouds. And this was the time of a poetry that was more kind of geared towards the mundane, almost the banal. The one poet of the time that Kathleen Raine felt some affinity to was T.S. Eliot and his poem, The Wasteland. which I think was 1922 when that came out. But this depicted this sort of very empty, banal, meaningless, pointless, indefinite kind of reality. He talks about Unreal City and things of that sort. And she could sort of identify with that, but in the sense that what that meant was that something very important was missing. And what she soon found out, or knew already, but had, in order to sort of fit in at Cambridge and with her new friends, had put aside, was that what was missing was this knowledge of the soul, which to her, and for Blake, and Yeats, and Coleridge, and Shelley, and all these others, meant knowledge of the imagination. So they sort of identified the two. And this was something that, it wasn't until some years later, in the 1960s, that she wrote about this. And there was a collection of her essays called Defending Ancient Springs. I think it was published in 1965, or 67, something along those lines. But in this collection of essays about different poets, there's this wonderful one called The Use of the Beautiful. And basically she asked, what place does the beautiful have in our modern culture? Where is the beautiful in our modern world today? And she said, it isn't anywhere. We don't have it. It's not there anymore. And this meant also that we didn't have the soul. We had no contact with the soul, because the beauty and the soul were two sides of the same thing. We recognize the beautiful because we have some sort of reflection of it in our own selves. It reminds us of our own soul. It reminds us of our own inner world. And this was something that was completely gone, both in the Cambridge when she was studying and also in more or less in the 1960s when she was writing this book. And what she came to understand as the learning of the imagination, or the lost knowledge of the imagination, was this kind of, almost a sort of geography of the soul that she found in these poets. And poets like Blake, and poets like Shelley and Coleridge, and Keats and the others. And if you know these romantic poets, their subject matter is not the everyday world. The subject matter isn't the kind of world that T.S. Eliot described in The Wasteland, or other poets were doing in the 20s and the 30s. And by the 30s you get the socially conscious and the politically conscious poetry that's all supposed to be about, progressive ideas and so on and so on. In many ways, similar to what's happening today, I think, in the humanities and in the arts and that sort of thing. But none of this kind of learning of the imagination was there. And when I say imagination, we have to understand that for Kathleen Raine and for the people she was writing about, it didn't mean some kind of fantasy world. It didn't mean some substitute for reality. Or it didn't mean, we tend to think of it sort of as the cutting edge, or, ahead of the pack in some way, using your imagination to, have the new innovative ideas and that sort of thing. Being original. Well, for the students of the learning of the imagination, being original is actually very important, but that doesn't mean being novel. That doesn't mean coming up with the next thing. It means going back to the origin. And the origin of all these elements of the things that make up the learning of the imagination is Kathleen Raine came to understand was the soul, was this actual part of our being that we've lost touch with. And what she found in the metaphors and in the images and in the symbols and even in the cadences, even in the sort of rhythms that these poets used. A good example that she points to is Coleridge's poem Kubla Khan. And Xanadu to Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure-dome decree. And if you know that poem, when I was even in the States and I was growing up, it was taught in school. And go back to it if you don't, if you know it, and if you don't know it, introduce yourself to it. Because basically, when you ask what it's about the imagination. It's about this interior journey. It's about this movement within that the learning of the imagination is about. Now, how did it get lost? Where did it go? Well, as I said, one indication that it was lost was this sort of materialist, reductive milieu that Kathleen Raine founding that took place much earlier in history. the most recent kind of, let's say, marker that can indicate when we lost track of this knowledge of the imagination goes to the early 17th century, the rise of what we've come to know as science, which fundamentally was a shift in our idea of what constituted knowledge and what were legitimate ways of knowing things, and what constituted in some way, evidence for this knowledge. And fundamentally, the shift in Western consciousness to a new understanding of what it meant to know something and how we knew it. This happened in the early 17th century. And fundamentally, it's the rise of what we know as science, and what that meant, again, in a nutshell, was that what constituted real knowledge and evidence of this knowledge was what could be measured and what could be, quantitatively sort of counted and figured, and explained and explicitly shown. This kind of explicit, mathematical, empirical, very precise sort of way of knowing something basically took pride of place over what had been an earlier different form of knowledge, or at least a different way it was understood that we could know things. And this was something that was what Kathleen Ray would call the learning of the imagination. But this shift that happened in the early 16th century, which today we're, in many ways, I think we're experiencing the breakdown of, the kind of dismantling of from within, with a variety of different things happening, post-truth, alternative facts, and in the heights of academia, postmodernism and deconstructionism, a variety of different ways that are undermining this whole way that came into sort of dominance in the early 17th century. That itself could be traced back to something that occurred quite earlier in the centuries surrounding, say, 500 BC, which was termed the Axial Age by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers. And you might have heard this term, the Axial Age. What Jaspers meant by it was that at this time all over the world you see the rise of the kind of fundamental ideas that civilization has been based on. This is sort of moral, ethical, religious sort of notions of how to act in the world came into place then. And these were through figures like Buddha in India, Confucius in China, the Jewish patriarchs in the Holy Land, Zoroaster in Persia. And while these characters kind of established the sort of moral and ethical guidelines of what would basically be more or less the way to, have a civilization, the same thing took place in Greece, but what happened there was something different. What occurred in Greece wasn't this kind of burgeoning of a new ethical and moral vision. It was the beginning of what we would call the scientific vision. And what happened then, fundamentally, was a shift from a more poetic, imaginative, metaphoric, participatory, figurative, embedded kind of way of being in the world and understanding the world, a mythological way of understanding things, to this new analytic kind of thing. Because what was happening in Greece and in the areas around Asia Minor, around the Mediterranean, was that people started asking questions. And they started asking questions about the world, and as one does when you're wondering about all these kinds of things. But what they wanted was not a myth. They didn't want a story telling them how the world came to existence. They didn't want a narrative explaining how things came to be. They wanted to know what things were made of. What is this stuff? What is this made of? What is this rock made of? And what is nature made of? What's the fundamental stuff that's behind everything? So it was a very different kind of question. It wasn't asking how did the gods bring existence into reality. It was about, okay, we're here, and what makes it tick? I mean, that's anachronistic because it wasn't until later on when we get clockwork and all that, but if you allow me that, they sort of wanted to know, what makes it tick? And this was the shift that happened in Greece, and this was the beginning of, rationality, the rise of reason and philosophy and so on, which reaches its kind of peak with Socrates and Plato. But even in Plato, we can see that the earlier kind of mythic way of seeing things didn't completely disappear. If you're familiar with the Platonic dialogues, when Plato wants to undermine somebody, when Socrates wants to kind of show somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, he asks lots of questions. He was called sort of the stinger. He got on everybody's nerves. He stepped on everybody's toes. He just asked lots of questions. That's why they, finally wound up killing him in Athens. But when he wants to sort of give a positive view of something, to say this is how I think things are, he tells you a story. It's not an argument. He gives you a picture of something. So this kind of pictorial, this kind of mythic way of understanding the world hadn't completely disappeared, even in the time of Plato, although it was more and more on its way out. And one of the people that I talk about in the book, this essayist, writer, philosopher of language, Owen Barfield, he argued that at an earlier time in our history, basically he argued that through the study of language, through looking at the history of language, we can come to a similar kind of conclusion that what I was just talking about in this shift of the Axial Age. That an earlier time in Western history, the way actually people perceived the world was very different than the way we perceive it today. Barfield was writing almost 100 years ago in the 1920s with his first book, History in English Words, but I think it's, the same thing holds true. What he discovered, to put it briefly, is that if you look into the history of language, the earliest language is very, very figurative. It's pictorial. It's full of metaphors. And what he discovered was that sort of the historians of language at the time, people like Max Muller, who was involved with translations of many great Asian religious texts, and other people, because of the kind of bias towards a sort of Darwinian vision of things starting out very, very simple and gradually getting more complex and built up like that, they assume that language first started with some kind of very literal grunts and groans that meant this and that, whatever, the ooh, ah, or bow wow kind of school of evolution of language, as Barfield refers to it. So kind of grunts and groans meant basically something like just that's all. And then somehow, by the time of recorded language, the language had become wonderfully metaphoric and figurative and poetic. And they couldn't quite understand how this could be, given this Darwinian vision of things starting out very simple and gradually getting complex. And they surmised that at some point, like a bunch of prehistoric poets just kind of got to work and just created this wonderful figurative language. Because no matter how far back you go, you never get to this kind of literal language. You never get to the point where there's just means just that. There's no point, it's just not there. The only language that's available to us to study is a language that's already metamorphized in that sense. It's metaphorical, it's figurative. So while people like Muller and all these others sort of bent over backwards to try to explain this, Barfield just said, well, maybe it's like this. Maybe the world was like that back then. Or maybe the way that people perceived the world back then was like that. The language is metaphoric and figurative and poetic and imaginative because that's how people saw the world back then. They didn't see the world the way we see it. We see the outside of the world as something completely different from this inside. I sort of made a joke on the way up here, and I haven't sort of got around to saying it, but you might be familiar with the philosopher John Locke in the late 17th century. And Locke, basically, his epistemological ideas, I think, were driven by political concerns in many ways, because he wanted to undermine the notion of divine right of kings. So he's the one who came up with the idea that all men are created equal in the sense that our minds are tabula rasa. They're blank slates. Rather like you have a flat before you go to IKEA. There's nothing in it. You got to go to the shop, buy a bunch of stuff, and bring it back. So what Locke said was there's nothing in the mind that hasn't got there first through the senses. And the joke I was going to say is I hope this evening we can figure out how we can unlock our minds. Because what people like Barfield and Kathleen Rain, and with any luck, some other people I'll get to, what they're saying, actually no, there's a lot in there. Then you wouldn't have this outer world. You wouldn't have this world of the senses if it wasn't already for whatever you want to call them, archetypes, images, a kind of picture that in some ways we through which we're able to actually have experience, through which we're actually Locke says that the mind sort of reflects nature. What these poets and thinkers are saying, no, it's the other way around. Nature is a reflection of the mind. And so Barfield is saying is that at a very long time in our history, this kind of radical separation between outer and inner world just wasn't the case. The barrier, the membranes separating the two were permeable, or in many ways weren't even in place yet. This is why he said it's impossible to point to any kind of time when you want to say that's the origin of language. That's when language started. Because, again, this whole picture of a world just like ours, in which, the cavemen were in, and just saying ugh to each other, and out of that, our whole very, rich, metaphor-ridden language emerged, just doesn't hold up. And what Barfield is saying, and I try to make clear in the book, is that language and the world and the sense of ourselves as individual selves all appeared at the same time. They're all part and parcel of the same kind of process. You don't have a world separate from a self until you have a language. And you don't have a self separate from a world until you have a language in order to somehow talk about this other thing, to separate. And we all go through a period, as far as I understand, in our very early years, when we're in this kind of, what Erich Neumann, the Jungian thinker, said, this Ouroboros kind of relationship with the mother. The baby is still in some kind of participatory relationship with the mother, where it doesn't feel a separateness. That comes in at 2, and that's why we have the terrible 2s. When they learn the worst word in the language is no. And by saying no, they're separating themselves from something else. And that no is the beginning of a sense of self. But that sense of self comes through being able to use language to sort of set the world outside. So Barfield's saying that some time in our past, we had this kind of participatory consciousness, but that we moved away from it. Now, many people, many of the Romantic poets that Kathleen Rain talked about, felt this was the fall. This was something that was regrettable. We've fallen from paradise in some way. But Barfield has a bit more practical view of it and said, no, this was something that was absolutely necessary. And he later found parallel ideas in Rudolf Steiner. He became a very eloquent apologist, let's say, for Rudolf Steiner's philosophy. And Steiner himself is not always the best person to have that job. And Barfield did a very good job of it. And Steiner, too, in his sort of vast kind of cathedral-like vision of the evolution of consciousness, there is a time in the dim past when there was no separation between inner and outer. There wasn't anything like a separate material, hard, physical world out there. That's the product of the evolution of consciousness. Now, most mainstream thinkers today think that's all wacky. Everything is just like this at all times. And we have to start with that and try to explain things with that premise. But as Barfield pointed out, one area, language, is a way that it just doesn't work. Now, I'm going to make a quick jump here from Barfield to the German poet Goethe. And it isn't actually as arbitrary as it may seem, in the first place because I actually talk about it in the book, and secondly because if there was one person who was a major influence on Steiner's view of reality, it was Goethe. Steiner started out as a Goethe scholar. He made his name translating, he made his name editing Goethe's scientific works, which nobody else wanted to touch because they thought they were kind of the stuff that we should just ignore. He was a great poet, but this scientific stuff is just embarrassing. But Steiner was very eager to do it because what he saw in Goethe's scientific work was confirmation of his own view of reality. Again, this notion that the inner and the outer is not completely separated. And in fact, the world itself that we think is out there already and is complete in itself is actually incomplete until our minds connect with it, until our inner worlds give it its content. The forms are there, but it's contentless unless our imagination adds to it. And what the central idea in Goethe's work that Steiner built his whole philosophy, his whole notion of supersensible perception, in which he claimed to have seen, the astral plane and the Akashic record and people's past lives and things of that sort, was built on this idea that Goethe had, was that he believed he became very interested in botany. I mean, Goethe wrote a great deal of science. He wrote about color. He took Newton to task over Newton's ideas of color and all that. He thought Newton was completely wrong. This was one reason why people were thinking, Goethe, well, fantastic, but let's forget about the scientific stuff. He's saying Newton is wrong. That's like flat Earth theory today. I was going to give you a quick rundown on Goethe's scientific record. But basically, he became very interested in botany, and he became interested in the metamorphosis of plants, how plants grow, and in fact, he inaugurated and developed the whole study of what we call morphology today, which is the study of forms, no forms past. And what Goethe believed was that there was something that he called the Urpflanze in Great German, the primal plant, the basic plant. There was other earth phenomena. There was these kinds of things that were they were the archetype out of which all the other plants came. And he also saw this in different ways as well. But he believed that if he could patiently observe, and remember I was saying earlier about this kind of detailed observation that Kathleen Raine, the poet, was interested in, wanted to find out in science. Like Goethe, she too combined the two things. If he patiently observed a plant, coming into its different phases of growth, he'd be able to see within that process this Urpflanze, which was something it wasn't a solid three-dimensional plant, but it wasn't just an idea. And he got into an argument with the other great German poet of the time, Schiller, who too was also interested in science. And they had gone to a scientific convention in Jena, in Germany. And they got into a conversation, and Goethe started telling Schiller about this. And Schiller said, "That sounds wonderful, but it's just an idea. It's not fact, it's not out there, it's not something." And he said, "Well, very good. That means that I can see ideas." And so Goethe was convinced it actually could see this Urpflanze, but it wasn't, you couldn't dig it up out of the soil. You couldn't pot it somewhere. Any plant you had at home that was potted, if you looked at it in the same way that Goethe looked at it, if you practiced what he called active seeing, you have the Urpflanze there already. You don't have to go get the Urpflanze. You don't have to go to the local nursery and get it. You have it there. It's in every plant that's there. It depends on how we see it. And the way he was talking about seeing it was very much along the same lines what Owen Barfield talked about, this kind of earlier form of participation, a way in which we saw the inside of things. And this is one of the central, virtues or characteristics of the learning of the imagination, is that we get inside things. I mean, our usual way of knowing is just the surface. We measure it and all that sort of thing. But to really know, something, I mean, I don't know, you can measure how long Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is. But to really know it and understand, you have to get inside it. In if you know what I mean, in the way that you're actually participating with the work. And just as if you really want to understand a great piece of music or a great, film or anything like that, you get captured by it. Goethe did that to the plant, and he saw that. Okay, last person I'm going to touch on. Now, so far I've been talking about ways in which we can see the outer world in this imaginative sort of way. But I want to go back to this this notion that what we're calling the imagination isn't like a faculty. It isn't sort of like something we can turn on and off. It's working all the time. It's the fundamental basis of how we understand and perceive anything. I mean, people like Blake and Coleridge and others, in the Hermetic books, in the Corpus Hermeticum. He's in here somewhere, Toph. The works ascribed to the great Egyptian, god of magic. The whole idea of imagination is fundamental. It's the fundamental bottom line of everything. And it's only in our time now that we've sort of pushed it aside into this kind of, okay, yeah, it's good to have, it's good for this, it's good for that, but don't get carried away by it. Well, we're carried away by it all the time. But along with being able to see the outer world, which is outer only by kind of, fiat or way of talking about it, with more imagination, so that it becomes more alive, more figurative, more poetic. Take that another notch. The imagination has its own kind of inner world itself. It has its own topography. I mean, I already said that rather than what's outside imprinting itself on our minds in here, so that the only thing in here is something that we've seen, touched, felt, or tasted out there. Now just think about that. Right? If you know the story of Helen Keller, she's somebody who had a lot in here who didn't any of those things, and touch and taste. I can't go into that right now, but if you remember who Helen Keller was, the famous blind, deaf, person who she actually was she I can't go into it right now, but aptly enough, she became a great reader of Swedenborg, who was another one who believed that the imagination was something that was fundamental. But the person I want to talk about now, I'm sorry I'm jumping around there, is this whole idea that the imagination has its own kind of inner topography, its own inner terrain, its own territories. It's an objective realm of its own. This was something that the French philosopher and Iranologist, student of Persian and Iranian mysticism, Henri Corbin, wrote a great deal about. And Corbin is important, well, for many things, for many reasons, but just shortly, he's important because he coined a term that's very useful and significant when we're talking about something about the imagination, to differentiate it from make-believe, or the imaginary, or that's just your imagination, or as Schiller said, that's just an idea. He coined a term called the mundus imaginalis, which is Latin for the imaginal world. And put simply, he posited this imaginal world. This is sort of the terrain, this inner terrain where visions, dreams, symbols, different sort of inner journeys take place. And it's not the physical world of the senses, although it's embodied. It's not vague. It has its own structure and it has its own occupants. They're inhabitants. As Jung found out when he went through his descent into the unconscious after his breakup with Freud, when he was, basically letting himself go mad in order to find out what was going on. And out of this, he brought back everything, we know about his work, collective unconscious. But he basically met people inside his head. And they told him that you think your thoughts are yours, but they're just like the trees and the animals in the forest. They're not yours. They have their own life. And you inhabit this forest, just like the trees and the animals do. It's not yours. And, understandably, Jung didn't tell a lot of people about this because he thought, he might lose a lot of work if they heard that the psychologist was talking to people in his head. But he wrote about it in his Red Book. And the kind of inner journeys that Jung went on in his Red Book, Corbin writes about in the context of a 10th century Persian mystic and Gnostic Hermetic philosopher named Suhrawardi, who sadly was executed under the order of Saladin in I think 1181, because he was like Socrates. He was accused of drawing the young away from their proper studies and all that. But Suhrawardi developed a whole kind of Gnostic philosophy based on this interior journeys. And he discovered, as Jung did, when Jung went through his own interior journey, and Swedenborg did when he went on his trips to heaven and hell, and a variety of other people did, that, again, the imagination, it's an interior space that has its own sort of laws and necessities. It's not just imagination run riot. It's not fantasy. If you're familiar with the famous differentiation that the poet Coleridge made between imagination and fantasy, and I talk about Coleridge towards the end of the book. Fantasy is different from the imagination because fantasy can only work with the products of imagination that have already been made. So a flying pig, you have a pig and you have wings, you put them together, ooh. Or a unicorn, or lots of products of surrealism and postmodern art and all that. They take what's already made and they put it together in strange, new, novel kind of associations. But it's not true imagination in the way that Coleridge understood it, or Blake, or Kathleen Raine, which I said before. It's original in the sense that it goes down into the depths. It goes down into the origin, which is the imagination itself. And it creates something that is new, something that is different, has a weight, has a presence, has a kind of gravitas about it that tells us and convinces us that this is something that's real. This isn't something that's just my, subjective fantasy putting something together. And Jung talked about this as, the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Kathleen Raine's talking about it in terms of the images and symbols, metaphors that she found in Romantic poets, which she discovered basically are rooted in Neoplatonic philosophy. Neoplatonism is a sort of variant on Plato's philosophy that was most associated with the philosopher Plotinus in the 2nd and 3rd sort of centuries in Alexandria. But as I said earlier, the whole idea of beauty and the soul being sort of reflections of each other. And the idea was that, unlike, say, surrealism and Dada and, say, expressionism and different varieties of more modern art, this traditional kind of order of symbols, it's a real vocabulary that is about, it's about what they consider kind of the objective realities of the soul, not just the personal, arbitrary, subjective kind of symbolism. Let me see if I have this correctly. So are you asking about this kind of states of imagination in which you sort of lose your own sense of self in some way? Well, I guess yes, in one sense. T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, said happiness is absorption, which meant basically he forgot himself in something. So yeah, I think that's one of the great joys of imaginative experiences. You read a great book or something, or these days, I guess, watch a film or something, and you're taken out. Although I say I'm taken out of myself more by reading a book than I am by watching a film. But yes, you have some kind of transportive experience. But another way in which I'm sort of talking about it is you can say there's a kind of interplay between the two. If the creative side of it is where you don't necessarily lose yourself, but you become aware of, in the whole process of creation, you become aware of this other part of yourself, which is kind of giving you these different ideas or insights or something like that, and then it's up to you to kind of work with them and work together. So in a way, that kind of reflects on this notion that it's not so much some kind of just complete sort of laissez-faire, to the imagination. It can produce whatever it wants, which is what movements like surrealism, let's say, and other, or the beat poets or something like that, thought it was the answer to a kind of too buttoned down, too reductive view, because that has its own dangers. So there's a kind of discipline involved there, which does involve the ego in some way. All right. Anybody? Well, the question was that is some sort of new science that would incorporate or integrate these ideas about the soul and learning of the imagination. Is that possible? I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good question. I think what is necessary is for whatever science that's being done, let's say, or its effect on wider, social realities, because we tend to look to science as being, we don't really look to poets or novelists or, religious thinkers to give us an idea of what's going on. We tend to ask scientists. So if as you say, if in the kind of grand pronouncements that are made about things, if the idea that, yes, well, we understand in those terms, but there's also this kind of stuff, if that was included, that would be great, but I'm not holding my breath for that kind of thing. But at the same time, obviously there are people that, there are people who work in science that are aware of this. I mean, just in London here, there's a whole society called the Science and Medical Network. They hold regular meetings, and Rupert Sheldrake's involved with that, with one of the big names. But so, I mean, there are people that are aware of this. I think all throughout history, all throughout the rise of science, there's been scientists that have been aware of this kind of thing. But it's not been the dominant sort of way of looking at it. So I'm hopeful, but it may take a while. One more quick one. A gentleman remarked that he noticed that in his dreams, the characters in the dreams seem to have a life of their own, and he wondered if that related to when I was talking about how the imaginal world or the interior world has its own sort of inhabitants. And I would say yes. I mean, this is precisely yes. I would say that's a short answer. Yes, it's like that. I mean, a variety of different people have remarked on this. I mean, Aldous Huxley, talking about his sort of mystical experiences, talked about the unmapped Borneos of the mind. I mean, this was back in 1956, but and the unmapped Amazonian basins that have their own flora and fauna. So there is this strange thing. I mean, I think we all, anyone who's ever meditated, anyone's ever spent any time just paying attention to what goes on in their mind knows that we have very little control over what's going on there. That's why this shop exists. If we had all this control, we would put Watkins out of business. All these spiritual disciplines are about trying to somehow gain a bit more of control. And I don't mean control in some repressive sense. I mean control in the sense that you're driving a car or you're navigating through waters. But I think that's one of the first things you recognize is that when you start to pay attention to the inner world, there's lots of stuff that comes unbidden. And you're discovering it. You're finding out that you're there. You're finding out that you occupy this inner space, along with all these other kinds of people, let's say. And initially, I mean, I guess the traditional kind of trajectory is you first sort of encounter your own sort of personal unconscious and all that kind of thing. But if you go deeper, wider, higher, whatever spatial direction you want to take, you start to encounter things that have nothing to do with you personally. They're not necessarily about your life. They're about you with a capital Y, a bigger you. But they're not, I mean, the classic distinction is Freud's, about your personal unconscious, and Jung is about all the other stuff. So, in a way, you could say Freud said yes, Jung said yes, go to a Freudian for a while first. When that's all cleared up, come see me. And then, I'll take you on this larger journey. So yes, I would say that's one of the first, one of the first steps. So, congratulations.